everybody. Thank you for joining me for another episode of The Warm Up. I am here today with Dr. Lydia Jennings, and she is one of the most inspiring people that I have followed on social media for quite some time. And Lydia, I just want to open up the floor for you to introduce yourself and tell everybody a little bit more about what you're doing and what you enjoy. So we'll start there.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Bree. So I'm Lydia. I am a member of the Pascoyaki tribe, so I want to begin by just introducing myself in my language, Loa Senshimima and Epo Lydia. And I am a soil microbiologist, but more broadly an environmental scientist. I'm really also a minor in American Indian policy, and so I'm really interested in Indigenous land stewardship and Indigenous sovereignty and how environmental sciences can be informed by Indigenous land care ethics. And then outside of my work, although it's becoming more and part of my work and trying to integrate it, I'm also a really avid trail runner. I mean, all runner in general, but trails more specifically. I think running is a really important way of getting to know the land and our ecosystems. It's a great way for me to spend time with my fur baby. And then lastly, where I come from, it's always important to really introduce yourself in relation to who you represent. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a member of the Pascoyaki tribe, but I'm also a daughter and a sister and a fur mama to a rambunctious blue heeler named Salchicha.
Thank you so much for introducing yourself. And like I was saying, I have been following her for a really long time, and I've been passionate about just everything that you share on your social media. She's also a fellow Arizonan, so she lives in Tucson, so I've been following her for a long time just because she's running in beautiful places that I also kind of know, but also just from your standpoint on just educating, teaching us about nature and the environment and how it relates to you as a Native American woman, and like growing up with so much more context, I feel like, of just being so in tune with the land and where you live. I feel like I've learned a lot from you over the past few years, and also love seeing you and your pup go out and explore. So I think I would love to have you start with just talking about, your experiences growing up in the outdoors, like having a Native American upbringing and like being so immersed in the land and with your culture, and just like how that has, I guess, presented your foundation and started your interest in soil biology, just everything, like just talking about your upbringing and like how that has enriched your life.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I think when I think about how my culture has influenced my science, my relationship to becoming a scientist, I often kind of compare it to some of the many lessons that nature teaches us, and one of the big ones is how life is kind of like a meandering river, and so we often think that the best pathways to something like an academic career is a straight shot, a channelized river system. And I think studying ecology has really taught me that channelized systems and rivers are not the healthiest systems, that meandering rivers are much more critical to that. And so much like my own experiences of how culture has influenced my academic pathway, I'm a real meandering river. And I think it's brought me some strengths, and it's also made this process very long. But, my dad's side of the family is Yaqui. I didn't grow up here in Tucson. I actually grew up in northern New Mexico in Santa Fe, Tewa lands. And so I think part of that, growing up away from my culture and amongst Pueblo people has really helped shape the way I think about ecosystems a little bit differently than even some of my own community members. Being in Pueblo lands and really learning from Pueblo relationships to the lands, and having, my first cross country coach was Dene, and he's an amazing runner himself. He would often raise money for our school by running the 4 sacred peaks of the Navajo Nation, and so it's kind of funny to think about today how much that influences my own work. But I just think in general, within Native epistemologies and identity, that we see a lot of nature as teachers and as relatives. And it's really funny, I didn't really think about natural resources until I went to school, and we would talk about taking courses in natural resources and quantifying the value of water, mountains, and timber, and how strange that was to think about the value, the economic value of something that is like so inherently critical to our existence and our being. And I often reflect, and it was really another Indigenous runner, Colleen Cooley, who often says, how would we think about the environment if we stopped thinking of them as resources, instead saw them as relatives? And I think that's an important aspect for so many of us. So I guess I'm kind of meandering around the question itself, but I think all of those are foundational of thinking about the actions and the decision making that we do today, and not how it's going to affect me and my current generation or my future children, but like how is it going to connect to those who are 7 generations forward. Something, I study mining reclamation. So something I often think about, like I use metals. We're talking to you today on a computer, and I look at, you follow me because of Instagram, which on my cell phone, which also says tons of metals. And in Arizona, mining is a huge industry here, and a really important part of our economic development. And we have many people who work in the copper industry or mining industry who are environmental advocates. And so I definitely don't want to bash the industry, but I also recognize that it does forever change our landscapes. And particularly Indigenous communities are often been the ones who are most impacted by that change, in part because of how we see and reflect in those relationships with our mountains, as opposed to seeing them as an inanimate object. And studying mining and being a trail runner has really made me, as I go up and summit these beautiful mountain vistas, think about what did my ancestors see when they came up here, and how am I following their footsteps and looking at these amazing vistas, and how they changed since my ancestors' view, but also how will my great grandchildren see these vistas. And that's something that I think is really hard. And here in Tucson, a very popular summit, you may have ran it, Bree, is Mount Wrightson. Awesome view. I think it's the highest of the 4 Tucson mountains. I love Tucson because we're hugged by these 4 mountain ranges. So the Tohono name for that mountain is Suduag, so that means long mountain. The Yaqui name, which I'm not going to pronounce, but it also translates to a plant, a sacred blue flower that is used for medicinal purposes. And so, we know that our communities have been in these mountain ranges. And when I hike to the top of Mount Wrightson, or run up to the top of Mount Wrightson, the top you can see the mine tailings, right? And I just keep on wondering, what was it like for my ancestors to come here, that I know have come to these places. I know that I'm literally following their footsteps and summiting this mountain. And the other part that's interesting is if you go in the Sarita Mountains and you can look over the Tohono Reservation, and it's just so amazing to look there and just like see pure landscape, not impacted by human development, not impacted by roads and highways. And in part it's because the O'odham people have fought really hard to protect their landscape. And so I think all of us, visitors and whatever generations of settlement have been here, can learn from Indigenous land stewards of the past, present, future.
I think there's so many different things that you just shared in there that were really powerful. And especially when you're thinking, okay, I'm up on top of this mountain and I'm reflecting on like, what did my ancestors see, and what will people for, 7, 8, 9, 10 generations beyond myself, what will they see? Will this even be here? Will this like remain the same? Like, what connections to, the true history of these mountains, of these places, of these plains, what will they know? Like, what will they be saying? Will they be honoring the sacred name? Will they be calling it something else? And I think when it comes to conservation, and like even what we're doing with just like litter pickup and stuff like that, there is so much to be said about connecting to the land, and really going back to what you were explaining, caring more about not just myself and what I'm doing to change and positively impact the environment, but then beyond my grandkids or their kids, like just so much further into the future, and thinking beyond ourselves is so important. And I feel like it takes a lot for the overall society to get to that point where we're thinking bigger than ourselves or our immediate generations beyond us. And I think that that is something that's so powerful about like native culture and indigenous culture, is that that is so embedded to just think bigger and beyond just you and I, and thinking about the environment and our natural spaces as like this continuous of like a branch off of yourself, I guess, is maybe the best way to put that. And like how powerful and beautiful I think that that is, to just think of like, the trees, the plants, like everything is just an extension of myself.
Yeah.
And how much more in tune that makes us if you really think about everything like that. Like we're all interconnected. Everything is exchanging energy, and we're supposed to be taking care of one another. And I just remember reading Braiding Sweetgrass, and just the idea of everything being reciprocal, just like, okay, I'm getting berries from these plants and I should be saying thank you, and then I'm going to go and I'm going to plant something else, and I'm going to go and like take care of the planet, and it's going to keep giving me more. And there's something really beautiful about that, but I don't know that we're there yet as a society, that is the perceived notion. But I think we need.
Yeah, and I think this is why, as a trail runner, um, a lot of my science communication has really been focused towards trail runners, because I think that we understand that in a specific, like, one, we have a really amazing, robust community of runners. There's like what, 13 million now runners total. I think 2 million of those are trail runners, 13 and 11 million are road runners. And so, like, we know we have a really strong, amazing running community. But the other part is, I think that runners, one, we enjoy hard work. We get up at like 5 in the morning to go run hill repeats for fun, right? Um, but also, we enjoy our sport, and our pastime is something that involves us being outside and engaging with nature on a regular basis. And so, in that process, you begin to see differences in your neighborhood. What's happening with this house? Why is that person's car parked here or there? Why are there's trash in this area? Why is there water flowing in this particular area? Right? We're constantly making observations, which is the first part of the scientific process. But also, I think it's in that, as we see the climate crisis continue on, that we're really recognizing how our pastime is being impacted. And so a big part of that, right, is this summer looking at how much forest fires have impacted people's ability to go and run in areas. Here in Tucson, last summer, or the summer before rather, we had the Bighorn Fire that was like Mount Doom every day, and it was really a psychological effect of looking at that really hit hard. And thinking about how we can use running as a way to bring attention to these environmental impacts, but then also help rally our community of runners to make those impacts, and to make those changes, and to increase our awareness. And I think that one thing that's great about running and our running community is that people are down to rally behind a cause. And so I think, like, we saw that with the Ahmaud Arbery case of this Black man killed while running, and so many runners understanding what a privilege it is to run in a safe place. And that's one of the things that I think makes me feel really hopeful about running in general. I'm working actually on a paper about running as a form of science communication, because I think it's a really interesting phenomenon. And you're seeing runners like Dakota Jones, who's starting the Footprints Running Camp, right? And to really rally youth runners to not only use their passion to be outstanding athletes, but also to create a more healthy future, environmental future. Those are some of the many things that make me feel so optimistic about running, and thinking about our land care ethics. And I think it's part of it is just changing this notion of how we've traditionally thought about the environment as something that we benefit from, but actually something that we have a responsibility to, so that we can continue to benefit from it, and that our future generations continue to experience it as close as possible to what we've experienced. And so you see, I think the mountain biking community has done a really great job at doing trail building days and building up that advocacy. I think the running community is really working on that. I've seen some really great initiatives in that. There's, of course, as anything, there's always space for improvement, but I think this is also a place where learning from Indigenous communities and many of their traditional land care ethics is something that everyone can benefit from. And so that's some of the work that I really try to do and focus on, is how do we continue to amplify the work of Indigenous land stewards in those areas.
Yes, and I feel like you're doing such an amazing job, even just by like the platform that you have, the things that you share. It inspires, like what you're doing, the not even a call to action, but just the educating, the sharing of the information. It, I feel like, evokes a drive and just say, I need to think about this more. I want to go and like get more involved in my community. I want to invest more of my time in learning about even like native species and things like that. Just being able to know, like, okay, what are the mountains around me called? Like, what is the soil in my area? Is this living soil? Like, what is the impact? What am I doing to impact this if I'm out running? You know, why should I stay on trails? What's the importance of being on trails? All of these questions that I think for most people, we just don't even think about it. If we're out, we're just enjoying it and it's there and it's wonderful. But it's like we really could just take a little bit more time to learn a few things about what's going on around us that make us care that much more. It just takes a little bit of energy, and then you're that much more invested in the spaces around you. And then that translates into wanting to preserve and conserve for longevity of these spaces to stay the way that they are and to be valued long term. And I think before we go into talking about Will Run for Soil, I just want to go back and touch on just what got you into soil science. Like, how did you get into the path that you're in now? And obviously, I know that has so much to do with your upbringing and just being on the land. But I just want you to go into it a little deeper before we start talking about your endeavors with advocacy.
Yeah, and I've actually shifted to speaking more instead of like on the land is to be with the land, right? Because recognizing that it's part of me and I'm part of it, and we're not placing myself above it. Just been a shift in language for myself as well. Um, but I think generally, like my grandpa was a master gardener. So he was always tinkering on the garden. If I wanted to hang out with him, that's what I would do. My dad's also a master gardener. So kind of same thing. Like I grew up with him, like digging holes and building, working on, he does designs rainwater harvesting systems. So like, hanging out in rainwater cisterns. um, and the first time I remember I wanted a swimming pool when I was a kid, I was like 7 years old. I'm like, I want a swimming pool. My dad's like, here's a shovel, go dig. And if I have to think about like my formative experience of becoming a soil scientist, like little did I know that was training me for doing a lot of digging, which is what you do as a soil scientist. So that's definitely part of it, right? Definitely family influence. But I think throughout like school, my like more formal education, um, running, I started running in high school. In part, it was really to get off campus. And it was really cool to like run, a big part of running is like making observations of your landscapes around you. And it was really cool to see like why soil colors are a certain color here and like why certain plants are growing there. And it was really when I started taking, I was initially a political science major. And I found that I really liked with environmental science classes. We got to go on field trips, and everyone was really like nerdy and excited to like name off the names of plants or like point out certain things in ecosystems. And I was like, these are my people. They're super nerdy. Like political science people, they just like wanted to see who could talk the loudest, And I was like, these people are so nerdy. Like this is awesome. So that's like really what kind of help begin that process for me. And then it was like I had the language to describe so many of the observations I was making when I was out on runs. And then I could share that with my friends and my family. And now, like for better or for worse, when people run with me, I'm like, look at this like cool formation, or like look at this not like this root nodule. And some people are like, Lydia, just run. But some people are like, oh, tell me more. And so and luckily, like I found two other women soil scientists who were like also so into running as well. But I think it's that process of like recognizing the different passions that we have in our life, um, that help bridge you to other passions. So for me, I ran in college, and then I got injured. And so as I got more and more into my science classes, I ran less. And I think it really allowed me to develop this like love for research itself. Um, and it was really when I came after I finished my undergraduate degree, I started getting back into competitive running again. Um, and then when I came to graduate school, my relationship with running was partially to like find a new community, but the other part was just a new way to experience a landscape. This is my dad's homeland, and so I found that I was going out for runs and learning different areas where even people from my reservation like didn't know about. And they've been here all their life. And so that was, I think, a really interesting dynamic of them being able to share that with community members. I actually started a series of runs for a while before the pandemic. They'd call it, we call them like Sko Runden, which is like a play. If you watch Res Dogs, um, it's a play on Let's Go Run Then. And I would, have friends who volunteer, and we would have distances from 1 to 10 miles, and have them kind of guided runs, meet at different trails. And it was that part of being able to share my love of trail running specifically, but also talking about ecosystems, getting often people to do a blessing. And one of the great parts is like seeing how friendships from that formed, but also people pointing out different, and sharing, this aspect of cross knowledge sharing. So I might share these things, but then people would share information with me about like their family, how they used to use this trail traditionally, or certain plants that they noticed, just like all that kind of beautiful information that comes as an experience of being on the land. And we often talk about, national parks, and it's like as like people's playground, but like for Native people, it's not a playground. It's a pharmacy and a classroom and a church. Um, and I think it's really important, like shifting it from just being a playground for some people, but actually being such a deeper place of reverence for many others. So
Yeah,
yeah, that's
I
that's
think
kind of how that came to be.
yeah, I love that, and I think that's so important to call out too. Is that I think the general maybe white perspective of these places is that it's like, oh, I can just go here and it's just a good time. But it's like, no, like this actually is a space that nature gives us so much and teaches us so much and offers us so much. And these lands, these plants, like there's so much intricacy to all of it. And like you even were saying, like, can I eat this plant? Like, can I use this medicinally? Am I able to, do blessings and offerings and with these plants? Like, what do these mean in different cultures? Again, referring back to braiding sweetgrass, but it's like sweetgrass is so beneficial to native cultures. And it's like, I wouldn't have even thought of that before I read the book, of just like this specific plant being so important and so valued. And like how many times I've potentially walked past it and never even really considered just that there's so much more depth to this plant. And how many other plants are like that? How many other plants am I around that I don't even know the proper name of them, or where they grow, or are they native to here or not? It's just like so many things that I feel like I can delve into to value it more.
Well, and to kind of provide a local example, right? Sweetgrass is beautiful, and one of the things, and actually, Robin Wall Kramer came here to University of Arizona, and I got to kind of do a workshop with her, and some high school youth. But one of the things that I found really interesting about the book itself, is conservationists will talk about like, oh, we need to just kind of isolate the plant here in this way, and her study actually demonstrated that like people are needed to help tend to the sweetgrass and to help take care of it, right? Like we are part of that ecosystem. And so, you're talking about nature, and I think it's so important to continue to also recognize that many native languages don't have a word for nature, because that was just our ecosystem itself. We are part, and we're part of that ecosystem. And I think it was really kind of more, European conservation ethics that really kind of talked about separating people from landscapes that I find really interesting. But I also wanted to provide a context that, you mentioned sweetgrass as something that's really, recognized in this important medicinal purpose in that particular book to the Potawatomi and many other Indigenous people. But here locally, we have a version, right? We have creosote, that many Indigenous nations, particularly the Lenape Nation, really recognize as a sacred plant. And so here in the Sonoran Desert, it's something that we also have to take care of. Many people use it as a running blessing, and just kind of recognizing that all of us are surrounded by medicines, and it's beginning to learn that, and then recognize how we have to protect those medicines. Yeah, and I think the other part, just to kind of add into that, is, I teach some courses, and I often have students who are not Indigenous to these lands and want to know how to support Indigenous people, but also not appropriate. And I think something that's really, I find really important to always remind too, is that like you are coming from your own background of environmental care practices that like colonization or different migration have, histories have really separated you from, but also reconnecting to that as well. And like, what was like, talk to your grandparents. What were your guys' like land care ethics? What are elements of that if it's gardening, right? Because I think like all of us have a different type of expertise from our own family knowledges as well that can be braided together for really powerful stewardship in the future.
I love that. I love that. And I would love for you to just go into, I guess, the transition into talking about We'll Run for Soil. Because I feel like when I saw all of this campaigning come up, I was so intrigued and I loved following along. And so, yes, I would love for you to share about We'll Run for Soil, where the idea came from, how you implemented it, what the campaign was, what it is becoming, and all of it.
We like to say we'll run for soil as a movement. No, but I think like again, running is a really big part of my own creation story as a soil scientist. Um, and it's really kind of what's helped influence that process. And so I'm really, as you probably know, I'm pretty active on the social medias. um, and there are two soil scientists that I met on Twitter, and we happened to be at the same soil science conference in San Diego. And usually at conferences I have like happy hours, which is like an okay to meet way to meet people, but like the way I connect with people is through running, right? And so these two women who I had been following and I thought were really cool, just the way they talk about soils, they had put out there like, we're gonna go for a run. Does anyone want to join? And I was like, me. And so I met up with them in the morning, and we just had so much in common, and it was really cool. And then they kind of made this like off comment about like, yeah, sometimes like over beers we like talk about it would be really cool to do something with like running for soil. And I was like, yeah, let's talk about this more. And basically like I think that they were interested, but it was kind of like this branch idea to them. And I kept bringing it up, and I was like, I want to be involved in this. And so eventually they invited me. I think that they had heard me do a podcast with like trail running women, and they had heard like how much soils was such a big part of my own story. And my running, it was part of my own story with soils. And so, yeah, then we kind of got together and got to know each other. That we had planned to do it a year earlier, but the pandemic happened, and we're three soil scientists, so like knowing how to like make a film is something that was really lost to me. um, and luckily Karen, so the other two women I should mention, Yamina Pressler, who's faculty now at Cal Poly, and then Karen Vaughn, who's uh, a tenured faculty now at the University of Wyoming, are the two other soil scientists, and they both do amazing work. With Karen makes soil pigments that are just for, it's called the Art of Soil, for the Art of Soil. Yamina does a lot of like painting workshops with Karen's pigments, and I think hers, I'm not sure what hers is, but her Instagram account is. But yeah, so both of the, you can find them us on at Will Run for Soil on Instagram. Um, but yeah, so we kind of developed this relation, this friendship through running and through soils, um, and applied for some different types of grants, and we were able to get $50,000 in funding, and then it became the process of like planning. And so soil scientists, great at maps, great at mapping, which is a really awesome part of it. I think at that point I had already had this relationship with Patagonia, so I reached out to them, and a couple of other companies. Gaia GPS is another one, to kind of see if they would be willing to support us. And then we kind of went out and mapped and actually drove our route. And our route itself was 135 miles. And we're like, wow, this is pretty far. What do we sign up to? And at that point, I think I had just finished my 50-mile run, which is the which is Run to Be Visible now on YouTube. And so I knew that like I could do 50 miles, but I'm like, oh, 135 miles, like this is a lot. And at that point, I had run the most out of any of the three of us. So I felt okay. But the other part of this is like it's not just running; it's also telling the stories of soils. And Karen and Yamina are both tenured faculty, and I had just defended my PhD, and so there is also kind of this intimidation factor of like explaining soils and making sure it's accurate, all those kinds of factors. And I think you like anything, you kind of might go into it with actual anxiety, but I think what's come out in the experience itself is incredible. And so we are still in the process of making it into a film. We have to like, even though we thought we raised a lot of money, it turns out making a movie is a lot more money. So we'll be doing some different campaigns in the future to continue to raise money and make this into a film. But I think what's really important is not only is it a film and an amazing trip with three women soil scientists, which is not who you typically think of soil scientists. Literature will tell us that the average soil scientist, based on current enrollments, is a 65-year-old white guy named Robert. So not us. And I should say like this, the run itself, we started in Nucla, Colorado in September, and then ended in Moab, Utah. And so I say in September because it was really hot. So freaking hot. And I'm coming from Tucson. Like I can handle heat. And it was a journey. It was a big journny.
Tell me about why you chose that route. Like what was it about that route, and like what, for the three of you as soil scientists, what did you learn along the way? What did you point out, or like what was the teachings of the journey?
Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of why we chose that specific area is we are soil scientists. We want to find dynamic soils. So we ended in Moab, Utah. Moab, as you may or may not know, is famous for its cryptobiotic crust. I had never seen any cryptobiotic crust before that. I mean, not that old. I've seen a couple here in Tucson, but they're just such an amazing like whole ecosystem in the upper 4 inches of soil, and they're so dynamic and incredible, and like most people don't see that. Yeah, so it's a community of archaea, fungi, bacteria, lichen that lives in the soil. Moab has some of the oldest, like they're thousands and thousands of years old. But even here in the Sonoran Desert, we can see them. They're kind of black crusts on the soil. And again, they take thousands of years to grow. They're in the arid ecosystems. They're really important ways of helping to stabilize the dust so that we don't have big dust events. But they're also really important ways of retaining moisture. And they're like a little soil forest, essentially.
Yeah. So when we see signs for living soil, this is what they're talking about most of the time, right? And this is why at parks and at national parks and things like that, people are requesting you to please stay on the trail, is because of how long it takes for these to grow and the importance of like what that actually is and what's living inside of them.
Yeah, and they're really important for thinking about, if we're wanting to do our part in addressing climate change, not disrupting these like really important little ecosystems that we as humans are not always cognizant of because they're below our feet, but play really important roles in carbon sequestration and just, nutrient cycling within these desert ecosystems. So they're really, really important in areas that might not have a lot of other vegetation.
Okay, yeah. That's amazing, because I feel like I kind of know some stuff, but I'm like, for anyone who doesn't know, it's actually really incredible crypto. Yeah, it's amazing.
They're really amazing, and we do see them in the Sonoran Desert, but they're like, I don't know, maybe the thickness of like a fingernail. Okay. But they're like 6 inches deep, and they have signs all over Moab that say like, don't bust the crust, and that's why. And we have definitely a lot of footage of like us going by areas that have been driven through and then other areas where they're growing. And it's just a really stark difference. Yeah. So I think like you asked why we picked that particular route. There are multiple reasons. One is just the dynamic of the types of soils that we saw. We also wanted to pick a trail that wasn't commonly utilized. And I think to this point, we've done the fastest known time on that. There's only been one person who's done like half of the route. In this particular route, there is like a 50K, I think, that goes through there a month later, which would be a much better time of year than when we did it. The other part, I think, too, well, this was at least really a part that was really important to me, is that picking an area that has a robust cultural history. So as an Indigenous soil scientist, I always want to know how Indigenous knowledge helps infuse and inform the way that we engage with landscapes, but also what the many land stewards of the past knew about these areas. And so, I mean, there's not a lot of published literature, unless they talk about like the petroglyphs of the Fremont people, which we actually ran by some. But, there's whole history of like Paradox Valley, which is just like an incredible valley, tons of mining, but also, like many parts of the West, a really violent history against the Ute people. And ending in Moab was, I think, a particularly interesting place because that was an area that was actually recognized as a place of having peace, because Moab was one of the few places that you could cross the Colorado River safely. And so also kind of recognizing, as we did this long run and ending, it was really important for me to finish by getting into the river itself and kind of recognizing this place of peace and of, fulfilling these important ancestral footsteps. We also got to like run by some really cool dinosaur footprints, and so we were literally running in the steps of giants, So just so many aspects of that. You get to see Moki marbles and just the different types of soil textures and colors, and we nerd out about all of that. But also we talk a lot about identity in relation to being a soil scientist, like something I had a lot of, to be perfectly honest. I have a PhD in soil science, but I sometimes don't feel like I'm a true soil scientist, especially being with Karen and Yamina, who are incredible teachers in helping you point out the different layers. And I studied mining reclamation, so a very different part of soil science. But also that like within this large discipline, all of those identities and existences and ways of knowing are part of that. I think that's really important as we think about identity in relation to our various pursuits. And then also just like seeing the fun part of it. And so we make paints. We actually made paints from the major places that we stopped along the way. And so at the end, we have like a really cool painting session and kind of reflection on that. And so it's about friendship, it's about adventure, and it's about soils.
What a beautiful experience. Just all of it. Like, it's so moving, and I can't wait to see the movie when it comes out.
Me either. I think part of it is like, it is definitely a running film as well. I got some real nasty blisties.
I'm sure.
And I think that many of us had some real emotional days. And my boyfriend crewed me, which I also think is really cool that like we had boyfriends crew us.
Yeah.
Because like you don't ever really see that in film footage, but like we know that partners of all types support you, and you have to have that emotional support to do really ambitious, crazy things, right? And so I really love that part too. It was just a really beautiful experience of friendship and science and introspection.
Yeah. So beyond the film, and you said this in the beginning, you're like, this is a movement. So what is the future for We'll Run for Soil? Are you wanting to do more of these longer effort, like basically awareness runs, adventure runs, or what are you wanting it to become? What's the next step for We'll Run for Soil?
Yeah, so for We'll Run for Soil specifically, our goal is to have this be an educational film. We want to have a series of educational packets that can go with it so people can show it in their classrooms, so we can submit it to different film festivals. Like that's definitely what we're trying to do with the film, but also have it be a way for people to think about the importance of soils and how to engage with their local elected officials to think about the preservation of soil ecosystems. I think one of the things we've talked about a little bit is, there's like, there's amateur like birding groups and rockhound groups, but we don't really see that same issue or same kind of community around soils. And we really want to help foster that because there are such an abundance of soils everywhere. It's one of the, as you begin to be able to see them and put on that lens, then you can really value and appreciate them. And so that's something that we really want to do with We'll Run for Soil as well, is help foster a community of soil lovers who recognize not only its value for growing the foods that we eat or in filtering out the water that we drink, but also just this intrinsic value for existing and for being beautiful. And so that's some of the efforts that we hope to help continue to foster and promote.
I love that. And I feel like, yeah, as this progresses, you let us know how we can support and like get the word out, because this is just such an incredible conservation effort and just educational effort that you guys are creating. And I think it's so unique and amazing, and obviously uses my favorite facilitator of education, which is running. So if there's anything that I can get involved in, I would love to. But yeah, it just sounds like such an inspiring and empowering experience, and I can't imagine that not translating to any person that would like watch the film and get involved to say, wow, you know what, maybe I didn't think about soils, but I'm going to be looking now and I'm going to pay attention and I want to learn more. And I think that that's such a beautiful aftermath of anything that we ever watch, that we're like, now this is making me think, and maybe it's making me, my wheels are turning in a different way than they were turning before.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think that is the goal. Like, I don't know if you ever watched Fantastic Fungi.
Yes.
Right, like Paul Stamets is amazing, and he gets you so pumped about fungi.
Yes.
And that's kind of our goal as well, is to get people pumped about soils and to see them and to want to learn more about them and to provide tools for people to learn about them, whether that's a reading list or different databases to identify your local soil, to get people starting their own composting. Like, we want to help support that. And I don't think, for whatever reasons, like soils aren't just, they're not seen as sexy as water or fungi are. We really want to help foster that. It has been, like, I know that you're really excited about this as an education content, and it's been interesting, I think, how people are kind of skeptical about like integrating running and science communication. And so that part has been really interesting, but also like any kind of person who does innovative, novel things are going to be met with skepticism, right? Yeah. And so that's the thing, that it's like really awesome to go through this experience with two other women who are also like, we're in this together, and like, this is going to be awesome. And like, we know it. We just have to like convince those who are funding this that it's going to be awesome. So I think like that's been really cool. But I will like mention that in each of the different types of presentations I do now, people are always asking about it, because I think as scientists, there are so many people out there who connect to place through running or through their various outdoor activities. I think we really need that. All of us, in whatever discipline you're in, whatever kind of work that you do, you need that other outlet in your life. And for many people, it's physical activity. And I think this notion of being able to integrate your intellectual curiosity with your physical outlet is a really novel and intriguing approach.
Yes, and this leads me to wanting you to talk a little bit about getting a charity bib for Boston, and like how you want to implement, just bringing awareness to you going and being a part of Boston with Wings of America.
Yeah. So last week I was invited to run on behalf of Wings of America, which is a Native, or it's a high school Native American running program. I was not actually, they actually have a competitive team. And then they also have a kind of leadership training camp. And so they bring, I think 16 different youth, high school students, to their headquarters in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and they kind of teach them on how to do coaching, and they all, I think, have to do some kind of community engagement project, and then they go out into their own home communities and work with youth. And so it's this really beautiful kind of mentorship and future leader training. So I was never actually on their team itself, but my first pair of spikes, my former cross-country coach, he used to be the former director of Wings of America, so my first pair of like cross-country or track spikes came from them. And so I've always had a really just strong admiration for the program and the current director, Dustin Martin. And he's asked me a couple of years now if I would be willing to run on behalf of Wings. And, I was working my PhD and then the pandemic, and so it just hasn't worked out. But this year, the stars aligned more or less. I have to get fit now, which is a little bit scary, but, and I'll be running the 2022 Boston Marathon, alongside, Verna from Native Women Running. And we're running on behalf of the Pursuit program. So this is a program that takes 5 students out to Boston, and they run the Boston 5K, but they also get to visit Harvard, and kind of just learn about the college process. So it's just such an amazing opportunity for Native youth athletes. And I'm really excited to get to show them around Boston and get to be able to do this mentoring and talk about my own journey of how running is integrated into my academic endeavors, but be able to learn with them. I think is going to be really beautiful. This is going to be my first race in like 4 years, maybe. So I'm a little bit nervous about that. I've done much more like adventure runs that didn't always have time pressures, this doesn't necessarily, but I don't want to do badly. So I definitely am feeling a little bit of anxiety about that. But like many things, I think having a purpose behind each run is really important. And so I've been ruminating a lot about what my purpose will be, and you're hearing it first here, but my plan is to be able to use each mile to highlight an example of land back, which is land being returned to Indigenous nations. I think many people hear it in the popular media, but aren't always aware of what that means. And land back can be the physical return, which land has been returned in the last couple of years from anywhere from churches to private owners to whole cities like Arcata, right? Returning the land to the tribal stewards of those areas. But also land back can also mean returning the land stewardship. Instead of co-management, having tribal nations make decisions about their own lands, which seems like wild. That's not the typical norm, that tribes can't make decisions about their own lands, but that is actually the case in many examples. And so I just I'm a soil ecologist, and I'm studying biodiversity in my current work as a postdoctoral fellow in environment, community, and policy. And so I think being able to integrate the work that I'm currently doing to also highlight examples of successful land back is just a really beautiful way to be able to bring attention to that. And also I want to provide educational content for those who want to learn more about it, want to learn about examples of land back, or want to learn how they can, give back their own family property if that's something that they want to consider. And I think that's really important just to know those different pathways. And I bring that up specifically because I heard during the last election, a lot of people said, well, if Trump gets reelected, I'm moving to Canada, and it was interesting from an Indigenous perspective to think, well, cool, just deed back your land to the tribe near you, and I think it's really important to remember that many tribal nations who have these long enduring relationships with the land and who are often celebrated for their abilities to protect biodiversity are still having a lot of issues being recognized or being able to access and manage their own ecosystems.
Can you talk more about that too? I would love for you just to talk about, just the pressures that are being faced with tribes wanting to be able to support the land and having land back, and just the whole concept around, being met with resistance and still struggling to purchase land back. I've seen several different, I'm not going to properly name what state it was or what portion of land, but I've seen tribes being able to purchase their land back to just take ownership, and just what the dynamics around that look like right now.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that we're currently seeing a movement move away, many environmental nonprofits are moving away from partnerships with wealthy landowners towards partnerships with tribal nations. So land easements are now going to land transfers. And I think part of that is, again, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know the full policy aspect of it, but my understanding from the literature is that in many cases, there's better protections in returning land or partnering with tribal nations instead of a private owner for land easements, in part because an owner can, I guess there's like certain policy you can put in there to ensure that there's not going to be the future sale of a property. And with the tribe, it's seen that there's more notion to better protect those areas and kind of keep them in an ecological state that they can't be developed. So I think that you're seeing examples of that. A really big one example, I would say, happen in the central coast of California, kind of the Big Sur area, Ohlone and Esalen lands. And so those particular tribes, the Esalen, I don't think they've ever had their own identified land base. So much of that was like partitioned out to private ranchers. And I like that area is really close to my own heart because I did my undergrad out there. And I remember talking and like going to the Esalen Institute to volunteer at the farm there, and it's this amazing, amazing piece of real estate that many people, particularly I think more new age type of teachings are taught there. And that's Esalen land that many of those indigenous people have never had access to. And so now what you're actually seeing is, for the first time, they're getting reunited with their homelands.
Yeah.
And part of the danger of like not having access to our homelands is that means like there's a disconnection. You don't have that classroom anymore. So the language and the traditions that you had and the farming techniques, you're disconnected and those can be lost, right? But we actually see this really beautiful process of now this regeneration of those relationships, and whatever elders are around, how it's like rekindling the knowledge of place, right? Just think about as a runner, you run by a certain area and how it triggers memories. Well, it's the same thing in having land back. It triggers those memories. It triggers those teachings in really beautiful ways. And so I think that part is really exciting about land back. I think a lot of people do get scared about what that might mean, and that you think it means going to be like kicking you off your land. And there has not been an example of that. I think it's been actually more the reverse of like Native people getting kicked off their land. So you also kind of asked like examples of land back practices. So I think famously in California, we saw these massive wildfires happening. And a part of kind of colonial conservation practices have been really stopping traditional fire burning practices, which are most widely recognized from the Yurok and Karuk tribes in Northern California, but there's much evidence of that also happening from tribes here in Southern Arizona and the Chiricahuas. And so because of fire suppression tactics, all of this fuel has built up, and it's often credited to one of the, contributing factors to these major fires that we're having presently. And so land back also means returning to those traditional management practices that have been in place. Now, it might mean that there are going to be more building restrictions, right? Because of recognizing that ecological importance. And I think that's something that we have to continue to think about is our sprawling systems, sprawling cities. But I think those are two really examples that I think are exciting. Another great example is also thinking about hunting permits and how some tribal nations aren't able to limit who can come into their community and hunt. So, those are really important factors. And the other part that I think often isn't discussed quite as much is also when communities can't regulate who comes in and out of their community, the pandemic being a really great example, there's community risks, and particularly like much greater risks to women, because it's been widely documented that because tribal nations are a sovereign nation, there's often an issue of who has jurisdiction for if a violent crime is committed there. And tribal nations have not traditionally had the ability to try someone who's not a tribal member because the courts see that as being a bias. So unfortunately, it's meant that Native women are often targeted. And so this land back is part of like protecting our communities in so many different ways. And I just kind of want to emphasize that as a woman, environmental scientist, I see it as kind of returning our traditional back to our traditional community structure.
I love that. And I kind of want to touch even more on what you're saying about being able to keep, even just members of your own community safe. And like women have to be so concerned because of how many undocumented women are being murdered and killed all the time. Like there are not any definite numbers of how many Indigenous women are going missing and being murdered, and like there's nothing anybody's doing about it, and it just blows my mind. I've listened to several podcasts that are pretty much dedicated to this and just how severe of an issue it actually is, and it's just not talked about. And I think it's starting to get talked about, but it's just not as commonly discussed, and it should be. Like, this is a huge issue, and I know that Jordan, she's talked about it, and she's run races and kind of been the voice and the advocacy face for it. But I'm curious if you have any recommendations on your end of any podcasts or like any articles, anything that people should be reading that is a good starting point to learn more about this, because I do think that it's like such a serious situation that people should be paying attention to.
Yeah, I have to, there's a podcast from the CBC about missing and murdered Indigenous women,
Yes.
And peoples. And unfortunately, I can't think of the name of it, so I'll have to get back to you on that.
Okay.
It might be the same one that you listen to, but it's really compelling. And I think it's important to recognize that this movement of missing and murdered Indigenous women, or MMIW, really began in Canada, but it's also prevalent here in the United States and also in Mexico. I think like we can often look at the young woman who went missing or who's murdered by her boyfriend, Gabby Petito.
Petito,
Is that her name?
yeah.
Right. And like there's so much media attention to that particular case. But when we look at how many missing and murdered Indigenous women and Black women go missing every year, and that's not the same level of attention, we have to recognize these power disparities in our society. And part of that, is also about these jurisdictional challenges. Other work that has been identified, there's a great work group here in Arizona, the Indivisible Tohono, who's been working a lot with state legislators. And some of the reasons I identified is that Native women are often misidentified. And so we don't have any formal database, but they really advocated and now have passed some legislation to begin creating a database of this and being able to record that kind of information, which I think is such critical work.
Yeah.
And I think in general, Native people are seen as kind of an invisible demographic. This is famously in the 2020 elections, right, where Native people were described as something else on CNN. And so these are all part of the process, the issues, right? There's also just like lack of education about Native people. I think many, and I've had to deal with this throughout my life too, many people see Native people as like being drunks and poor. And unfortunately, see that our communities are worthy of being sacrificed, which is really problematic, and that's an aspect of colonization. And so I think the work that Jordan has done in bringing attention to this issue and recognizing how our Native women aren't safe, and that can be by our own community members and it can be by external community members, right? But like this is why it's an issue. Women are the backbone of a community. And if our women are missing, then our communities, our future could be in jeopardy. And so this is why it's such critical work.
I also want to just kind of tap into what you were talking about as the Native American community being seen as this invisible community, and kind of loop back to you doing your movie, like your short movie about Run to Be Visible. And I want you to just kind of discuss that and like what that experience was like, what the concept is, and the importance of that.
Yeah, before I get to that, I know I was connected with my dog. And so one thing I did kind of want to highlight is that, Arizona has a really high number of cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women.
Yes.
So I think Tucson's number 3 and Phoenix is number 5. And it's something I often think about when I'm on my trail runs.
Yeah.
We talk about the lack of diversity in trail running as a sport in general. Even though we know Native communities have always run. And I think that's also just something to reflect on, that there are many Indigenous people who run, but like the safety aspect of going in really remote trails is something I think that most women think of, but particularly of Indigenous women, where you can be in kind of vulnerable positions. And I think about this a lot because I sometimes enjoy going on long runs by myself.
Yeah.
And, like I personally feel a lot of feelings when I see Border Patrol, or when I see a group of like white males and I'm by myself. And I definitely note how I'm talked to differently than like when I'm running with my white girlfriends, or even when they're running like, for example, I was on a run and, I felt like these older gentlemen were questioning my ability. Like, oh, this is your first time here, huh? Like, look at just like wearing your shorts and you only have that pack and you brought your dog. And I'm like, I do this all the time.
Yeah.
And then like my girlfriend, when she was behind me and was going to catch up to me, and I'm like, do they say anything to you? And she's like, no. And so just like those kinds of things, right? And I know that like everyone is in a process of learning and unlearning and relearning, right? And so I just kind of wanted to also bring that up is like, how do we think about making our experiences on the trail safer? It's something I have to learn how to do too, because I know sometimes I see people and I'm like, they don't know what they're doing, but I have to check my own biases. And so I just wanted to also bring that up.
Yeah, that's so valuable to reflect on, because I mean, even as a female, I'm always like, yeah, I don't ever leave to go on a run without thinking about what potentially could happen. Like, what am I wearing that could potentially have someone say something to me or potentially touch me in a way that I don't want to be touched? Like, I think as women in general, we always are scanning, but then even at another level, it has to just be a constant just barrage of thoughts of like, what could this mean for me to be out here today? Like, will I come back from this run? Will anyone know? Will anyone say anything? Like, that is a terrifying reality to have to do that, to have to think that, as a Native American woman, like as an Indigenous woman going out, that if something were to happen, like what would happen for me? Would I get media attention? Would something be said? Like, I honestly feel like that is more terrifying than just the idea of, someone saying something to you, but just this more amplified reality of what that could look like.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know we're going to talk next about the run that I did, but there was like one or two times, one time I had to like do a really heavy weekend of training out on the Arizona Trail, and I couldn't find anyone to go with me. And it was like, I had my dog with me, but like camping by myself was kind of a scary aspect. And unfortunately, it shouldn't be scary. I feel safe in mountain ranges, but just like that recognition of like something happened. So what, all the different safety precautions I took of like checking every day with my Garmin spot and, carrying a taser on me and like all these other aspects, which adds weight to my pack, like all of these other things to take care of my safety and how frequently I checked in and just those kinds of things which are unfortunate,
Yeah.
But also an important way of staying safe. So yeah, I just wanted to add that in.
Yeah, I'm glad that you did, because that's such I feel like more people need to know that is the reality, and that is something that you actually think about this every single time that you're going out. This is the reality for a woman of an Indigenous community, like any woman of color, any woman that's like out trying to do something that, there aren't a lot of people around, but the people that you run into may or may not have ulterior motives. You never know. And what that situation could look like for me versus that situation looking like for you. And that's just, it's frustrating that is the reality. And that I feel like that, like, what is the answer to that? Like, how do we resolve that, I guess? Because that's such a scary and something that I feel like it's like not something that you or I could control changing.
Yeah, but I think the important part that always helps me remain hopeful is that we are those seeds of change, right? Like, I feel comfortable to go out in these spaces, and I've had so many great experiences with people that I've met along the trail who I feel like have really taken me under their wing in a way that my mom never felt safe. And so I think just like by having these conversations and by helping people to rethink those biases and also how they engage and how they can be advocates to make change and make these our different communities safer for others, makes it safer for our future generations. And so I think that's really important. I love, what was her name? It's like Chackwork Baddie or something on Instagram. And so she had a really great post recently about like running your sports bra, and like that's not an invitation to like hit on her or to follow her home or like all of these other things. And I remember that having been told so many times, like, oh, well, if you're running in your sports bra, like you're asking to be hit on or whistled on or like something. And I'm like, actually, it's just like 105 degrees in Arizona and it's really freaking hot, So, I think having all of these conversations are so critical to making, outdoor spaces safer for all of us.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's the whole concept of like, yeah, maybe I'm out running in a sports bra, but a guy runs with no shirt on all the time and no one's out there, saying anything. It's just so frustrating. And then, yeah, just the amount of people, even that I've had conversations with men, and they're just like, I never even thought about that. I've never even thought about that.
Yeah.
And just the value of, yeah, what you're saying, just having these spaces to have the conversations and bring up that this is the reality that is being faced and that it's not being dramatic, quote unquote, or, trying to, I don't know, make it into something that it's not. It's like, no, this is really happening. And this is the stuff that we have to think about before we go out. And these are the things that we face and the situations that we have to consider that we may come upon by just being outside doing something that we enjoy doing.
Yep.
I think it's super valuable to bring it up and to have discussions around it. So I really appreciate that you did.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And I would love for you to just touch on Run to Be Visible before we kind of wrap everything up.
Yeah, definitely. So I think I mentioned that I am the class of 2020. I'm the class of COVID. And it was really I don't know, it was really crushing, to be perfectly honest, that I worked on something for 6 years of my life, some really precious years. And I had envisioned for so long, I remember all the time, every day, riding my bike home, and I'd pass by Old Main, and then in April and May, you would see students taking their graduation photos, and I'm like, I can't wait till that's me someday. And I would see the people getting ready and taking, and just think about that moment and being able to share it with my friends and my family and make them so proud. And then the pandemic hit, and that year there was gonna be 14 of us Indigenous women graduating with PhDs. So it was going to be such an awesome, huge year. But then our graduations got canceled. And, rightfully so, we have to take a pandemic and as is a serious entity that it is, especially how hard it hit Native communities. But it really made me feel really heartbroken, but also have to pivot and think about how can I celebrate my PhD in my own way, create my own ceremony with it. And I'm a runner. So, and I had just won this contest to get 6 months of free training. And so I was like, well, I'll do my first 100-miler, which I've never done a 50-miler before. So that was really ambitious. And I was still working on writing my dissertation. And, but that's what I wanted to do. And then as I was working my dissertation and trying to figure out when I was actually going to walk or not, or actually just graduate and defend, I was maybe 50 miles is a better idea. But so I had come up with this idea all through when I was on runs and thinking about how I want to make this ceremony for myself, that it would be really cool to highlight 50 Indigenous scientists. And part of that was, at this time, a lot of the country was mourning the murder of George Floyd. Yeah. I think many people were reflecting on kind of just racism in general, I think, but particularly in the sciences, a lot of people were thinking about kind of the roots of our fields of study. Mm-hmm. And in ecology, it's really interesting that so much of these teachings are based off of Indigenous knowledge, but we are never taught about Indigenous scientists. We're often taught about Arthur Tansley in 1913, but a lot of the methods that he's talking about are Gregor Mendel, but there are a lot of native geneticists, plant geneticists, or native ecologists, and we have a lot of very long enduring oral histories around these sciences. But a way of native knowing and being is that this knowledge is held as a community collective, not attributed to one individual. And so I thought that was really interesting. And I guess thinking about the many people who helped influence my own career pathway and supported and mentored me and who've really served as role models, I wanted to highlight them because I recognize that a PhD is a hard process. Yes. I'm doing it today when I've had the benefit of the hard work of all those who've come before me. But what was it like for them before? What was it like being the first Native PhD? What did they experience? Because I definitely heard a lot of things you only because you're Native American, or you can only do this kind of work, right? And this is like 2022 or
Yeah.
2020 at the time. And so I really wanted to highlight these individuals, the kind of work that they do, the diversity of tribal nations, and the diversity of fields of study. And so I thought it would be, after seeing Jordan Marie Daniel, who we've already talked a little bit about in her 2019 run to honor missing and murdered Indigenous women, I was really inspired by that to dedicate each mile to different Indigenous scientists. But I also thought back on my runs to the people who created my own pathway. And so I thought back to that high school coach, Edison Esquisse, and how he ran the 4 Sacred Peaks to raise scholarship money so that I myself be able to finish my high school. And so I really wanted to honor him in the capacity of using this run not only to highlight these Indigenous scientists, but also to raise capacity for future Indigenous students. And so I supported myself throughout my undergrad with waitressing and bartending. And I just really had to reflect, if the pandemic had happened when I was a student, I don't know if I would have been here today. And so how can I support those future students? And I was really involved throughout my education with the American Indian Science and Engineering Society. So I asked them if they'd be willing to partner with me and use this run as a way to fundraise for their program. And they have this scholarship specifically for students impacted by COVID. And so, then I reached out to Jordan, and she was just starting a production company. And I also reached out to Patagonia, since I have this relationship with them. And I was like, maybe we can get some cool photos,
Yeah.
and like do a little media about it. And they're like, well, we're going to partner with Jordan to make this into a film. And I was like, oh my God.
What a way to celebrate your graduation.
So now it's like, okay, I get to relive it all the time now. And it's actually made a much bigger ripple impact than maybe if I had actually had my graduation, because I get to show the film in different parts of the country and talk to different students all over the world. But the run itself, it happened March 20th. It was the hottest day in March in 2021. Sorry, I'm getting my years all mixed up. And the area that we ran was 50 miles along the Arizona Trail, starting kind of on Passage 4, and then running up to Passage 7. So 50 miles. A big important part of the area was around the Santa Rita Mountains, which, as I kind of mentioned earlier, are really sacred mountain systems to my tribe. So that was really intentional. We ran by the area that's been the Arizona Trail that's actually been changed because of the proposed Rosemont copper mine. In my dissertation, I wrote a lot about copper mining, and particularly that mine, because I looked at tribal consultation in mining. And so I had gotten to know that particular section so well through looking at soil studies and environmental impact statements and legal cases, but then to get to experience it through my own footsteps, I felt like it was a really holistic way to complete my PhD. And then I had a list of the 50 scientists that I selected and dedicated each of them. Some of them, I invited a couple to come out, but they couldn't make it because it was a pandemic still.
Yeah.
But friends came out to kind of support. And so I felt like in that way, I didn't have a graduation party, but I had this like really amazing run. And so I think I've never done 50 miler before. I think it was like 13 hours total, but 11 hours running. And it was just like really emotional. I had a friend who drove all the way down from northern Arizona. She's like my family adopted sister,
Yeah.
And so it was really beautiful. It was really beautiful. And I cried a lot. I cried a lot on the run, and there is this like, your body holds on to, and this is something I talk about in the film, like your body holds on to so much emotion. And it was like 2020 and 2021 were just like such emotional years, and a PhD is so much emotional years, and like I just felt like I hadn't been able to cry.
Yeah.
And then like it just all kind of came out on the run. I don't think they caught that much in the film because I was like really embarrassed to cry on camera. But like there are just really beautiful blessings that were shown to me along the run as well. And I think we've kind of already talked about this, but like in ultra running, you can't do anything without a community. And I feel like the same way in an academic journey, you can't do that without a community. And my community really showed up for me.
That's so beautiful. And I can like almost tell you getting emotional telling, like reflecting back on it too, and just how powerful of an experience that was, and just like, you know, the emotion around not getting to graduate and then it becoming this bigger, even better, like more personal and intimate experience that you get to now reflect and share with everyone, and honor so much more, like we've talked about before, like bigger than yourself, you know, like yes, it's about your graduation, but then you also got to honor all of these scientists and everybody that came before you, and like all of the people that came along your journey to like get to where you are now. It's so beautiful.
Yeah, it's been really cool. You know, especially to hear from some of the people and who I like honored, and some of them didn't know. I try to reach out to as many as possible, but some I just like couldn't find them. But like one professor who's up in North Dakota, so she was like, "Yeah, one of my students showed me your video, and like I didn't even know that I was honored." And she was like, "Congratulations!" And I was like, "Oh, thanks." So that's been really cool. Each of the screenings has been honestly like kind of emotional because, you know, a lot of the talk about is like what it's like to exist as an Indigenous person in the academy and the challenges of that, and like why I think we need to have Native faculty to support Native students. You know, that's because of like my own experience in academia, like being very challenging, but then also finding Native faculty to kind of have in your corner and help you navigate that process. And each of the screenings, I have students who come up and share their own process, right? And like the challenges they have, and it's that part really gets me. But also how many share that they feel seen and they feel inspired, right? And it's like we so need to hear those stories that we often don't hear. And so I'm really thankful to Patagonia for producing this, but also to the really diligent storytelling and advocacy that Jordan did, both in setting an example, but then also being able to partner with her to tell this story. And just the care that she's done it, and like making sure it was done in an appropriate way, and by having Native artists and musicians part of this film, I think that is also just such beautiful heart work and such a beautiful completion of this bigger circle.
Yeah, and I just have to say, like, I'm getting emotional, just like, you know, like even getting to experience just like how much this has meant to you, and like the just depth that this touches for you and your community and everybody that was involved. Like, it's just so beautiful to hear you speak on. And obviously you're touching so many lives by creating this. You're also letting other people that are going through, you know, PhDs know that they're not alone, and you're inspiring so many other hopefully like Native American community members to go after their dreams, and that like even if they're the first person to go through this and they feel alone, that they have people in their corner that are going to support them and uplift them through their processes. How beautiful that is. That's such a way to propel and move people forward, and just to say like you belong here, you deserve to be here, like your intelligence matters, the things that you're interested in, this is so important, please don't give up on what you're trying to pursue, and like this is what comes out of it. Like, that's so beautiful.
Yeah, it's been really amazing because I've had like one student who reached out to me, and she's just got the same like fellowship I got, the NSF, the National Science Graduate Fellowship Program. And, you know, so many of the questions that I had as I navigated my PhD of like, how can I do this and serve my community? And ultimately, I found a way to do so. And like you hear in the film from our tribal attorney general, who's also my friend's dad, and like I'm so honored that he was willing to be interviewed for this, you know. But like the importance of that, and I get students who will message me and are like, I'm really struggling with this, and like, how did you integrate your passions together, and like, how did you serve your community? And I don't know if what I'm studying serves my community. And I feel like that's such a common question so many people have. I think Indigenous and non-Indigenous, right? And unfortunately, if like you're Indigenous, you often don't have a role model for that. I didn't meet another Native PhD person, like meet them, until I started my graduate program. Like, how wild is that to go your whole career and not knowing most of your education, not knowing another Native scientist, right? And so I think this is where, so Run to Be Visible is about increasing the visibility of these Indigenous scientists, but also recognizing the visibility of Indigenous people in all aspects. And so this is why often when we do screenings, like it's so powerful to have Jordan, because I think her run in the 2019 Boston was really to make visibility the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women.
Yeah.
But now in her role as a filmmaker, she's really making visible this aspect of like storytelling in behind, both in front and behind the lens. And for me, similarly, partnering with her is making visible Indigenous scientists of the past, present, and future.
It's just, yeah, I love this. I'm so glad we touched on it. I'm so glad that you shared and led us into the backstory of just like how much heart went into this video, this film. And I want everyone to know that you can go and watch Run to Be Visible. It's on YouTube. Is it anywhere else, or just YouTube is where they edit?
Just on YouTube, but I do have an announcement to make.
Okay.
So it was selected to be part of No Man's Land Film Festival.
Congratulations. That's
Yeah,
great.
so I'll be attending the flagship festival in Denver on March, but I think it'll also be traveling to different film festival near you. So hopefully.
Oh my
But yeah,
God.
you can also watch it on YouTube as well.
Yes, everyone go watch it and support Lydia, because it's just such an incredible, I've watched it. And so it was just really cool to be able to like hear you talk about it now after also watching it, and just like, yeah, your emotion and stuff. It just feels like, I'm like, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm, like a part of this too, because I've watched it and just seen how much it means to you and the heart that went into it too. So yes, everyone please go watch it. And then before we wrap up, I just have a few finishing questions. So where can people find you online?
So on Instagram, I'm at LLCoolJennings, and there I primarily post kind of like running things and my random reflections. And then on Twitter, I'm at OneNativeSoilNerd, and that's much more like science-y type of work. I also have a website, www.nativesoilnerd.com. There kind of have, if you want to look up some of my research, I have a lot of my past media interviews. I'll probably add this podcast on there.
Perfect.
As well as like a page of resources, both of like learning about Indigenous history or decolonial reading lists, but also just about some things about how to navigate graduate school.
Amazing. And then you can also follow Will Run for Soil on Instagram, which is at Will Run for Soil. So you can follow along with that movement as well, which is incredible. It's one of my favorite things to just kind of tap into and just see the amazing things you're doing. And then what does keeping nature wild mean to you is my last question.
What is keeping nature wild? Well, I guess like it makes me reflect on what does wild mean, because I think, again, we kind of come into this like conservation term, that like wild is kind of a conservation term, but I think I would say is more of like keep nature in relationship, is more of how I would think about it. And so that means paying your homage and paying respect and caring for it as a relative that nature is, and being respectful, cleaning up after yourself, all of those kinds of things, but also being really thankful and grateful and doing what you can, whatever your different gifts are, to protect these places.
Love that. Love that so much. Thank you so much for taking the time. This has been an amazing conversation. I've loved everything you've shared. I'm just so honored that you took time to come on here and speak with me. Really looking forward to seeing all the things that you're doing, all the videos you release, all the films, and also seeing you in Boston. It's just going to be incredible to see this all come together. So thank you so much for the time and for making space for me.
Yeah, it was great to be here with you. Thank you so much for the invitation, Bree.
Yeah, thank you.